A good question to start with might be why North Korea and why North Korean biodiversity? And obviously, the vast majority of research on North Korea is very understandably focused on human systems, including the North Korean economy, the military, the functioning of the North Korean government, and human rights in the country. And in light of the importance of those issues, biodiversity and the wider environment of North Korea is often overlooked. But it has important implications for the country's human population and for regional and global ecology. Unfortunately, in North Korea, by contrast, reforestation programs have generally struggled from poor or incomplete implementation. So our findings published last year in Regional Environmental Change indicate an important shift in North Korean forests that corresponds to the period in the 1990s referred to as the Arduous March, a period when the collapse of the North Korean economy and the public distribution system and the onset of a major famine brought about severe human hardship. The second important theme from our findings is the exploitation of wild animal and plant populations. And a key theme here is that periods of severe hardship and shortages of food and basic goods for ordinary citizens in North Korea have underpinned their interactions with wildlife. The consumptive use and trade of mammal-derived products is widespread, both legal, though often poorly regulated, but also illegal. And this was found to encompass almost all native mammal species over 500 grams in body mass. North Korea does have some suitable habitat remaining. As I mentioned at the start, big cats in particular have been recovering in northeast China over the past 2 decades in areas very close to the border with North Korea. However, inside North Korea itself, the quality of habitat has slightly deteriorated since the 1990s. And the availability of large-bodied prey is extremely mixed. So a number of key deer populations seem to be heavily depleted, although wild boar populations, for example, seem relatively healthy. Furthermore, this also has an impact on South Korea directly, particularly South Korea's aspirations for natural recolonization by endangered species.
세계에서 가장 폐쇄적인 국가로 북한을 이야기합니다. 우리는 흔히 비무장지대, DMZ에 때묻지 않은 자연을 상상하지만 그 철책 너머의 숲과 야생은 지금 소리 없이 죽어가고 있습니다. 이번에는 UCL의 조슈아 파일 박사가 수년간의 연구를 통해 북한의 정치 경제적 현실이 어떻게 해당 지역의 생태계를 무너뜨리고 있는지 살펴봅니다. 고난의 행군식이 식량난으로 무분별하게 벌목이 이루어진 결과 북한의 숲은 대대적으로 황폐화되어 왔습니다. 북한 주민은 생존하기 위해 야생동물 사냥에 나섰고 이제는 호랑이와 같은 최상위 포식자마저 국경을 넘어 밀매되는 현실입니다. 북한의 호랑이는 몇 마리나 남았을까요? 현장 조사가 불가능한 북한 땅의 진실을 밝히기 위해 조슈아 파일 박사는 북한 이탈 주민의 기억을 재구성해 과학적 데이터로 기록해왔습니다. 잘 알려지지 않은 북한 지역의 야생동물의 생태계를 살펴보도록 하겠습니다.
Okay, today we invited Dr. Joshua Elves Powell of University College of London. He is a very young but very distinguished scholar on this North Korea's political and economic conditions impact on terrestrial biodiversity. Biodiversity really matters. In 2025, we are excited to have you, Joshua Powell, Dr. Joshua Elves Powell. All right, the floor is all yours.
Good evening, everyone. As mentioned, my name's Dr. Joshua Elves Powell, and I'm a conservation biologist and an associate lecturer at UCL in biodiversity conservation and ecology. And I'm going to discuss an often overlooked aspect of North Korea, the country's terrestrial biodiversity, and new research which indicates how it might be impacted by the country's political and economic conditions. A good question to start with might be why North Korea and why North Korean biodiversity? And obviously the vast majority of research on North Korea is very understandably focused on human systems, including the North Korean economy, the military, the functioning of the North Korean government, and human rights in the country. And in light of the importance of those issues, biodiversity and the wider environment of North Korea is often overlooked. But it has important implications for the country's human population and for regional and global ecology. And the reason for that is that the Korean Peninsula, in fact, occupies an important site for, as I say, regional and global biodiversity. So in the early 20th century, it was part of the second most diverse region of the world for large carnivores. It has a highly mountainous landscape with large areas unsuitable for agriculture and industry. And the advantage of this is that it provides a mosaic of habitat refuges suitable for a wide diversity of wild animals and plants. It also provides important sites for migratory birds on the East Asia-Australasia flyway. And just looking at a map here of the Korean Peninsula, it's obvious that North Korea is key to the maintenance of a corridor between the Korean Peninsula and meta-populations of terrestrial species in mainland Asia, particularly in China and Russia, and those species which can't fly or perhaps swim between those countries and, say, South Korea. And in recent years, there's been a recovery of a number of these important mammal populations in northeast China, along the regions bordering North Korea. But the status of many of these species in North Korea is poorly known. It's currently impossible to conduct reliable, direct scientific field surveys in the country. And even when these have been possible, they've faced major restrictions. For example, there was a 1998 survey for Amur tigers by the Institute of Geography for the DPRK Academy of Science, which was conducted in partnership with Russian scientists. And although in recent years opportunistic surveys have been conducted, for example, for birds, this is a particular issue for mammals. Mammals are often elusive, cryptic, and nocturnal. So opportunistic surveys are usually unsuitable. And furthermore, these surveys have provided little information on socio-ecological systems in North Korea. That is how biodiversity relates to the people of North Korea. But there are several alternative options that we can employ. One that we look to implement is a local ecological knowledge-based approach. Now, LEK is a type of ecological data that's based on the knowledge of local communities about their environment and the wildlife they share it with. It's traditionally applied with current residents. For example, in the photograph on screen at the moment in Kyrgyzstan, it might be applied with local community members here to establish sightings or perceptions of, say, snow leopards. But this is impossible in the context of North Korea. So instead, it would be applied with former residents, that is, North Korean defectors or escapees in South Korea and in the UK. And this draws on and will be familiar in the context of studies which have used interviews with North Korean defectors to elicit information about human systems in North Korea. But as a natural scientist, that involves a number of adjustments to our way of thinking about this form of ecological data. First, it involves adjusting our understanding of who are the experts, who are the specialists. And that's not restricted to individuals with formal scientific training in zoology or botany, but perhaps, say, a hunter or a soldier who's had the opportunity to spend considerable periods of time in relatively remote regions of North Korea. Tied to this, it's really important to seek to understand different understandings of and names for species. So in the context of North Korea, we can't assume that the local common name, what someone might call an animal, is the same as that is used in South Korea. And this was certainly the case for a species that I will discuss later, the sable, or to give it its scientific name, Martes sibylina. And finally, there are limited opportunities to verify the reported data, but these are not entirely absent. So, for example, we were able to verify reported changes to North Korean forests against satellite-based remote sensing, which might give us additional confidence in our data. So what I wanted to do is take a look at a few of the key findings from our work. The first concerning the degradation of North Korea's forests and the potential political and economic drivers for this. So first, to provide some broad context, forests are an important part of the Korean ecosystem and support a wide diversity of terrestrial species. So in South Korea, considerable progress has been made on restoring forest cover that's been lost through historical demand for timber and firewood and extensive damage during the Korean War. thanks to major reforestation efforts in the 20th century. So the photograph on screen at the moment of a forested mountain slope, although this is secondary forest, the restoration of this habitat represents a significant conservation gain right across South Korea. Unfortunately, in North Korea, by contrast, reforestation programs have generally struggled from poor or incomplete implementation. So our findings published last year in Regional Environmental Change indicate an important shift in North Korean forests that corresponds to the period in the 1990s referred to as the Arduous March, a period when the collapse of the North Korean economy and the public distribution system and the onset of a major famine brought about severe human hardship. So what the figure on the left shows is a wave of deforestation moved northwards during this time period, indicated by a decline in vegetation cover, so registering in orange, into the northern provinces. While in the south and west of North Korea, areas which had historically been more heavily cleared saw cropland expansion, and that's indicated by the bright green colors. And while the North Korean economy has since recovered, the overall picture is of continued decline in total forest cover, marked by the solid line on the graph on the right-hand side. The second important theme from our findings is the exploitation of wild animal and plant populations. And a key theme here is that periods of severe hardship and shortages of food and basic goods for ordinary citizens in North Korea have underpinned their interactions with wildlife. The consumptive use and trade of mammal-derived products is widespread, both legal, though often poorly regulated, but also illegal. And this was found to encompass almost all native mammal species over 500 grams in body mass. Since the 1990s, there's been a growth of an informal market in wildlife products, and this has emerged in response to the country's economic and food crises, because, of course, ordinary residents could no longer rely on the state to meet their basic needs for survival. And of course, wild animals and plants may serve as a valuable source of food, and that includes luxury foods, a source of clothing, fur specifically, for winter clothing, or for use in traditional Korean medicine. And this corresponds very closely to the rise of North Korea's second economy. And lots of the patterns that you see here are in line with informal trade in other goods. But another important aspect from this time period was the establishment of cross-border trade with buyers in China. So cross-border trade to China, once established, it appears to have continued despite, again, improved economic conditions in North Korea. And this now seems to be a major driver behind exploitation of wild animals and plants in North Korea. And this involves a really wide diversity of species and products, just some of which are provided here. So that includes subsistence and medicinal uses, some of which will be familiar in the context of South Korea, and others will be unfamiliar to most listeners, as well as skin trade in a very wide range of fur-bearing species. And this has consequences, quite serious consequences for exploited species. For example, one carnivoran that was previously present in North Korea, but is highly valued for fur trade, was the sable. Photographed, and our findings suggest that if sable is still present in North Korea at all, it's now extremely rare. It was spoken of almost like a mythical animal by hunters that we interviewed. Our findings also indicated the importance of wildlife as a natural resource for the North Korean state, both to supply raw materials, for example, skins, as I say, for the manufacture of winter clothing, but also to generate foreign currency, specifically through trade with buyers from North Korea's main economic partner, the People's Republic of China. And it's important to note that some of this trade is legal, but other elements of trade are illegal and constitute, in some cases, wildlife trade as state crime. Either they're in violation of UN Security Council sanctions, they're in CITES Appendix 1 listed species, which are highly protected, with parties to CITES, specifically China, or involve the North Korean state being linked to trade in species that are protected under North Korean law itself. And this has broad ecological consequences for the whole Korean Peninsula. There are clearly unequal pressures on key ecosystems across the peninsula, and this varies by geography, ecosystem, and taxon, and perhaps we'll get onto this a little bit more in the questions. But if we were just to look at one specific group, so terrestrial large carnivores, species like big cats and bears, North Korea does have some suitable habitat remaining. It has a comparatively low human population density compared to South Korea. And there is clearly the potential for recolonization from China and Russia. As I mentioned at the start, big cats in particular have been recovering in northeast China over the past 2 decades in areas very close to the border with North Korea. However, inside North Korea itself, the quality of habitat has slightly deteriorated since the 1990s, and the availability of large-bodied prey is extremely mixed. So a number of key deer populations seem to be heavily depleted, although wild boar populations, for example, seem relatively healthy. Furthermore, this also has an impact on South Korea directly, particularly South Korea's aspirations for natural recolonization by endangered species. And one example would be discussions around whether the Amur leopard could ever return to South Korea. It was only lost from South Korea in 1970, so relatively recently. But this is highly unlikely, while human threats in North Korea remain severe. So some key takeaways here. Although it does have certain geographical advantages in terms of its location, North Korea's political and economic conditions present important challenges for biodiversity, and this has consequences for North Korea's people. A major issue is the degradation of North Korea's forests, which may be logged to generate a tradable economic resource or to create agricultural land, but which, if left standing, provide important ecosystem services and habitat for North Korea's human and animal populations. For example, North Korea is routinely classified as one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change, and it's particularly prone to flooding because of its topography. And this is something that's likely to be made worse by deforestation on high elevation slopes. And continuing shortages of food, medicine, and basic goods for ordinary citizens underpin the exploitation of wild animals for consumptive use and domestic wildlife trade. This fits with broader patterns that we see around the world, and that's by both the state and by residents. However, it's important to note that since the 1990s, there has been this shift where animal products have been increasingly funneled towards cross-border trade with buyers in China. And unsustainable and illegal wildlife trade does have consequences that extend far beyond the borders of North Korea. For example, the persistent threats to key mammals in North Korea does present a risk to China's conservation aspirations in their shared border zone. And furthermore, cross-border wildlife trade from North Korea to China may undermine China's CITES commitments. So taken together, these trends undermine North Korea's important natural resources and need to be addressed as a matter of urgency. Thank you very much. I just wanted to say a few words of thanks to the organizations listed here, and in particular to all of the North Korean participants in our work, without whom this really wouldn't have been possible. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, Joshua, Dr. Powell, I mean, I think it's a very interesting biodiversity. And yeah, let's start with, your major point on this cross-border wildlife trade. And that actually is one of the main reasons, for North Korean people, probably not overnight, but also probably, rural residents, to capture, especially in the large, mammals. And then, export those remains and parts, to China. I think that it's happening from Southeast Asian countries, Myanmar and Thailand and partly Vietnam. But is there any particular pattern of North Korean export, illegal or pseudo-legal cross-border wildlife trade to China? And then we found in South Korea there is a North Korean wildlife remains. For example, Gyeongdong market in Seoul. that means this wildlife trade, say loot, it's reaching not just China, but also South Korea, probably some other part of the world, probably Japan and others. So what you take on it, and then especially the peculiarity or uniqueness of North Korean wildlife trade politics or ecosystem.
Yeah, no, really interesting observations. And I mean, certainly in terms of South Korea, it's my particular specialism is in large carnivores, and particularly big cats.
Mm-hmm.
And it is something that we have noticed from previous work on big cat trade in South Korea, that we were picking up reported examples of tiger bone wine being sold in South Korea prior to 2009 that were labeled as coming from North Korea. Of course, it's impossible to tell whether that is actually authentic or not because these are historical records. So there are two possible explanations there. One is that it really is tiger bone derived, and the other is that it's manufactured using a different species and then it's labeled as tiger derived. And we don't currently know which of the case is true, what was going on there. One of the major medical universities in North Korea has been mentioned as an origin source on products that have been picked up in China by Chinese officials before and relatively recently. So it's certainly an interesting subject and potentially very concerning. If it really was authentic, there's a couple of different sources as to where tiger bone might come from. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's coming from wild animals. So a relatively major issue worldwide is the production of tiger-derived products, including tiger bone wine from captive tigers. That's certainly an issue which is currently much in focus in the context of Southeast Asia. So that may well be the case if that is authentic, but it would still constitute a legal trade. So as I mentioned, China is a CITES party, and tiger is an Appendix 1 listed species and subject to a whole range of other restrictions on trade. And the reason for that is obviously that tiger is an endangered species, and trade is a major driver of the loss of tigers worldwide. Within North Korea itself, we definitely see patterns in trade. So relatively complex trade chains, perhaps surprisingly. So provinces along the border with China, particularly North Hamgyong and Yangon province, serving as kind of main gateways for cross-border wildlife trade. So a resident from a province further south might attempt, say if they captured a common raccoon dog or a badger, which are both animals, they could then be traded on to another resident and then enter trade through that route. And there are definitely patterns at different times of the year. So around Lunar New Year, which is a time when in China families come together and have large celebratory meals, often with many different types of meat on the table. That's a time which is particularly targeted for trying to sell deer, so venison, and also pheasant meat as well. And it was reported that North Korean hunters who managed to capture these species, if it was outside of that time period, they might just consume it themselves. But there was a particular push to try and sell these particular animal products, these types of wild meats, just in that run up to Lunar New Year.
I mean, it's pretty natural for us, to assume that the population of wildlife, especially large mammals, including wild cats, decreasing, shrinking. I think it's in North Korea and South Korea and other countries actually try to prevent this type of disaster, natural disaster from happening, or say the recovering from this type of disastrous situation. They use the word endangered species, and then does North Korea have endangered species list you mentioned that there is a law, to prevent this type of exploitation, excessive exploitation of the wildlife in North Korea. But just like South Korea and China and the United States and UK, does it have this type of list of endangered species?
Yes, so there is a
What
list
are
of,
they then?
kind of domestically in what. So we consider species to be endangered either globally or domestically. And North Korea has, I think it's fair to say, relatively good infrastructure in terms of the institutions that are in place and the kind of designation of species and sites for protection. There is a relatively heavy focus in North Korean law on what are considered to be useful species. So species that might be economically valuable, essentially, for the state. But that's relatively similar to South Korean law. So there are elements of South Korean law that that is what protection for different species is based on. And part of the difficulty, as with anything that involves trying to understand the legal status of particular activities in North Korea, is that obviously the North Korean legal system is very complex. And in the case of individual species, they're sometimes subject to very specific, say, presidential decrees that specifically mention individual species. And that might be around like the way that a species could be harvested or should not be harvested. So, for example, there's a presidential decree that dates back to 1959 that specifically protects a couple of mustelids. So these are a member of the weasel and otter family. And so, for example, sable, the species that I mentioned, the fur bearer, is specifically protected from exploitation under that presidential decree.
Thank you for your very interesting the presentation. At the same time, this lively discussion, and then your very warm heart on the protection of wildlife, especially big cats.
Well, thank you very much. No, it's been
So
lovely to speak to you today.
All right, thank you.
오늘 우리는 조슈아 파웰 박사의 연구를 통해 북한 주민들의 생존 투쟁이 어떻게 광범위한 숲의 파괴와 야생동물 포획으로 이어졌는지 확인했습니다. 개인의 생계로, 생존으로 시작되었지만 이제는 북한 당국의 매화벌이를 위해 여러 동물이 포획되고 이를 유통하는 불법 무역까지 이루어지는 상황입니다. 북한의 야생지역은 이제 서식지로만 남고 동물은 사라지는 빈숲 현상이 진행된다는 조슈아 파웰 박사의 경고는 무엇을 의미할까요? 국내적으로는 한반도를 가로지는 철새의 서식지와 이동경로를 위협하는 것이며 국제적으로는 멸종위기에 처한 야생동식물의 국제거래를 규제하는 사이테스 협약을 져야 한다는 것입니다. 북한의 환경 문제는 더 이상 북한만의 문제가 아니며 동북아 전체 생물 다양성에 직접 영향을 미치고 있습니다. 한반도 생태계의 미래는 결국 하나로 연결되어 있기에 파괴된 자연을 복원하기 위한 국제사회의 시급한 관심과 준비가 필요합니다.